r/Nosleep. Posted by u/JTB685. Every fall, my family plays the better behave game. Each year, when the leaves change color, my family plays a special game. The rules are simple: don't misbehave, otherwise you get a strike. We play until the first snowfall of the season, then whoever has the fewest strikes wins a prize. The person with the most gets taken away. Last year, my sister, Eliza, won, like always. I came second. George, my older brother, came third, and my other sister, Mary, came last. I was sad because I liked Mary way more than George and Eliza, but father said if we didn't send her away none of us would survive. The twins, Peter and Ruth, are too young to understand the rules, so they don't have to play. Yet. This year, I got off to a bad start because George was being a jerk. He stole from my plate while father said grace. I heard a noise and opened my eyes right as he stuffed a handful of my berries into his big, fat mouth. Before I could do anything, he swallowed them whole. I jumped up on the bench and grabbed George into a headlock. We wrestled around. Right as he started biting my arm, father slammed the table. We froze. The vein in father's forehead was showing, which is how we know when he's really mad. Mother said, "That's one strike for Luke." When I opened my mouth to protest, father raised his hand. We never talked back when father raised a hand. Doing that is an immediate strike. Even though it was totally unfair, I sat back down. Father lectured us about respecting our elders and behaving when they're speaking. He talked for so long I thought I might starve to death. Then, when he finished, he started saying grace again. I peeked open my right eye and saw George stick out his tongue. Later, when I was trying to sleep, my stomach grumbled every time I closed my eyes, so I snuck out of bed to get a snack. Our cabin is built around the kitchen. It's a big room with walls made from red bark. I pressed a chair against the wall so I could climb onto the counter and reach the top cabinet. The second I touched the handle, someone cleared their throat. I spun around. Mother was standing there in her nightgown. She had one hand pressed against her swollen belly, where my next little brother or sister will come from. "Yes, I'm serious." "That's 2 strikes," she said. A few days later, George and I went for a walk. See, because I was in last place, he'd been on his best behavior. And behaving all the time is super boring. But if it was just the 2 of us, we could have a little fun thanks to the bonus rule. I should probably explain the bonus rule. George came up with it 3 years ago to make the game more fun. Whenever he and I were alone, we never squealed if the other one caused trouble, even if one of us got really annoyed or upset. It meant we could still have fun while waiting for it to snow. We followed the path that runs around the lake near our cabin, skipping pebbles across the surface and climbing over boulders. George boasted about how I was gonna lose the game. He said all he had to do was keep behaving, then I would be the one to get taken away. "No, I won't," I said. "You're an idiot. Which means sooner or later you'll do something stupid and mess up." George punched me in the arm. Hard. And because of the bonus rule, if mother or father asked about the bruise that was starting to form, I had to make up an excuse. We came to a small clearing in the forest. In the middle, there was a smoldering fire pit. Somewhere behind us, a twig snapped. George said somebody was coming and we should hide. While George crawled under a hedge, I looked back and realized the person coming was Eliza. She was following us. Eliza always wanted to hang out with us, but George said she was boring and told her to pound sand every time she asked. I had an idea. I dared George to pull back a branch and let it hit whoever was coming in the face. See, if George had hit one of the townspeople, I wouldn't be able to tell on him. But if he hit Eliza, I wouldn't have to. She would race straight home and do it for me. "You're just trying to get me into trouble," he said. I started mimicking a chicken. George rolled his eyes. "Do you really think I'm that gullible?" "Bwok bwok bwok, George?" I asked. George grabbed the branch and got into position. When Eliza stepped forward, he let go. It whipped around, lashing her in the face. She fell to her knees holding her left eye. George laughed until he realized who he'd hurt, then he tried to help Eliza to her feet. He said, "I'm sorry," over and over again. She shrugged him off and started back to the cabin. George grabbed a stick and offered it to Eliza. "Here, you can hit me in the eye as revenge. Just don't tell." He followed her out of the pit, begging her not to say anything, apologizing again and again. I punched the air. Strike 1 for George. When George realized he couldn't stop Eliza from squealing, he charged after me. You knew it was her. He had the same vein in his forehead that father gets. I ran, but not very far. George tackled me to the ground and punched my chest repeatedly. Mother and father wouldn't notice the marks there. We waited until sundown to return. George thought father would have calmed down by then. Boy, was he wrong. Mother and father were waiting for us on the front porch. Eliza was sitting on mother's lap, her eyes all red and puffy. Peter and Ruth were running around chasing fireflies. Father stood as we walked up the path. George gulped. "That's strike one for George," Mother said. George walked right past them and straight into his room. He didn't even come out for dinner. 2 weeks passed, and nobody caused any trouble. I got this sinking feeling in my stomach like I was falling. We were getting really close to the first snow, and I was in last place. I'd lay awake all night, worrying that when I looked outside in the morning everything would be completely white. I kept expecting George to screw up, but he was super careful. If I was going to avoid getting taken away, I had to trick him into misbehaving again. Luckily, father made us start rationing food. That meant George was always hungry, which meant he was always on edge. One evening we sat down to dinner and father started saying grace. I peeked open my left eye, checked no one was watching, and put a handful of George's berries on Eliza's plate. Then I deliberately bumped the table and pretended I'd had my eyes closed the whole time. George reached across the table shouting, "Hey!" Eliza slapped his hand away. They both grabbed her plate and wrestled over it. George accused Eliza of stealing his berries and she denied it. Father slammed the table. They both let go of the plate at the same time, sending it flying into the air. A shower of berries came down on father's head. His forehead vein surfaced, and he clenched his fists. Mother got up and began picking berries out of his beard. "That's strike one for Eliza, and strike two for George," she said. "George, you and Luke are tied for last place." George opened his mouth to say something, but then father slammed the table so hard we all jumped. Even mother. "Bed. Now." Eliza immediately got up and left. George looked like he was going to argue for a moment, but then he got up and stormed off. I wasn't sure whether father meant me as well but didn't want to take the chance and followed them back to the cabin. The next day, father sent George and me out to collect firewood. Eliza came with us. George wasn't happy about it, but father insisted we take her. We wandered far away from the cabin, then George asked Eliza if she wanted to play hide and go seek. She jumped up and down. "Yes. You guys never let me play with you." George said she had to be at first. The minute she started counting, we ran off. We spent the next few hours playing pirates, dueling with the sticks we'd found. At one point George decided he was the captain. I said he was too stupid to be captain. For that, he hit me in the finger with his biggest stick. I yelped. My finger started to swell up. I said I didn't want to play anymore and we went back to collecting firewood. Lying beside a tree, I found a huge spider. It was bigger than Eliza's hand and hairier than father's. I scooped it up, then the next time George bent over, I dropped it down the back of his neck. He threw his sticks in the air and squealed like a girl. I nearly fell over laughing. Once he got the spider out of his shirt, he chased after me, tackled me to the ground, and sat on top of my chest. Then he stuffed moist, dead leaves into my mouth. As he did, a dark figure appeared beyond George's left shoulder. I tried to speak but couldn't. "What's that, Luke?" George asked. He was too busy laughing to notice father was standing right behind him. A snowflake landed on the tip of George's nose. Next thing I knew, father grabbed him by the arm and said, "George just lost." Father lifted George into the air and spun him around. Eliza was standing right behind them, crying. George looked like he'd seen a ghost. "No fair, Luke misbehaved first," George shouted. "He put a spider down my back. And he did it before it started snowing, so he should lose." I felt a knot in my stomach. I couldn't believe George broke the bonus rule. Father turned towards me. "Luke, is this true?" I thought the vein in his head was gonna explode. Terrified, I spat out the leaves and shook my head. Father looked at George, then back to me. After a few seconds, he turned back around and dragged George towards the cabin. Eliza and I followed along, quietly. Whenever George tried to speak, father shook him and screamed, "Shut up." Beside the front porch, Peter and Ruth were catching snowflakes on their tongues. Their noses were all red and shiny. Father stormed past them and up the steps. Mother stood. "George is this year's loser," he said. Mother ordered Eliza and I to our rooms. I waited for a second. "But now I Luke," Mother said, angrily. I spent the next few hours curled up in a ball, crying. George was the biggest jerk on the planet, but he still shouldn't have lost the game. He was right, I had misbehaved before it started snowing. I had to tell the truth, even if it meant getting sent away. With a deep breath, I got up and exited the room. A voice in the back of my head kept telling me to go back to bed. Why should I get taken away? It said. George is an asshole. He deserves it. George was an asshole, true. But he was also my brother. And besides, I didn't hate him. Not really. Despite all the fights and insults and arguments, I actually loved him. Kinda. And we had fun together. Sometimes. Without him, things would be pretty boring. Especially when it was time to play the game again. I found my parents standing around the kitchen table. George was lying on top of it, naked. Mother and father had drawn dotted lines and arrows all over his stomach, chest, arms, and legs. George was staring at the ceiling. Mother. Father. I said. George's head slumped towards me. His eyelids fluttered a bit as he drooled all over the table. Mother spun around, then bolted over and took me back to my room. Luke, what are you doing up at this hour? We're getting ready to send George away. Go back to bed. Now. I have to tell you something. I grabbed her hands and started crying. I was the one who misbehaved first. Before the snow. And I even lied to father about it. My voice started to crack. I should be the one you send away. Not George. Mother stared at me for a moment. She looked back toward the kitchen, sighed, then kneeled down. Luke, what you just did was very, very noble. She wiped away my tears. And I am so proud you. You are? I asked. She nodded. MMMHMM. In fact, it was so noble, I think you deserve to win the game this year. Does that mean I beat Eliza? She smiled and nodded again. I threw my arms around her. I couldn't wait to see the look on Eliza's face when she realized she hadn't come first. Mother put both her hands on my shoulders. And as reward for winning, you get an extra helping of my special beef stew tomorrow night. I hugged her. I love you, Mom. I love you too, Luke. The next day, we sat down to our annual end of the game feast. And since I'd won, I got the biggest serving. Eliza pouted the whole time. It made the stew taste even better. Father belched. Well, I must say that was one of the closest games we've ever had. It won't be next year, said Eliza. Luke just got lucky. Next year he doesn't stand a chance of beating me. I'll win for sure. It won't be so simple, said Father, still chewing. He gestured towards the end of the table, where Ruth and Peter were getting more of their stew on themselves than in their mouths. Next year the twins will be old enough to play. You might have some competition. I finished off my bowl and held it out. More please.